Hi, my name is Barry Horner, and I'm your host on today's episode of Stake and Soul, the podcast that's dedicated to demystifying the world of employee ownership. Stake refers not just to the financial or beneficial ownership, but also to the vested interest, the sense of responsibility, and the feeling of belonging that comes with being an employee owner. Soul is all about company culture, the values, the shared purpose, and the human connection that are amplified and shaped by employee ownership. Soul is the company's silent language. Join us for Series 1 as we sit down with business leaders and CEOs who have successfully navigated their journey to employee ownership.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you today Liam Toms, Communications and Engagement Manager at Grapevine. Based in Dorset, Grapevine has spent over 30 years evolving from a mobile provider to a full-scale managed IT and telecom service provider. However, its most significant transformation occurred in March 2023 when the company transitioned to 100% employee-owned via an employee ownership trust. This move was so successful that Grapevine was recently named the EO Rising Star of the Year at the 2025 UK Ownership Awards. Well done for that, Liam. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a minute. As the founders approached retirement, they faced the classic dilemma: sell to a large trade sale buyer or find a different path. They feared that a trade sale would lead to consolidation, the erosion of their unique culture, and the potential loss of long-term staff, some of whom had been with the company for over 25 years. Pete, one of their founders, said, "For Grapevine, becoming an employee ownership trust just felt like the right thing to do. An EOT offered the opportunity for long-term stability and for the company's values to continue for the years to come." So Liam, welcome to Stake and Soul. Great to have you with me today.
Thank you, Barry. You've had some fantastic guests on the show so far. So yeah, very honoured that you've taken the opportunity to include us in this.
Great to have you winning that amazing award. So as a communications company, I guess today we'll dig in a little bit into the communications. What does good communication look like in an EO business? Be good to talk about that and engagement as well. But before we do that, just an opportunity really to hear a little bit about Grapevine. How did the company start? Your specific role, what you do, and then we'll move on and talk a little bit about what precipitated the change. Obviously, in the introduction I've just read out, there was a number of options that probably the directors at the time looked at, but it'd be good to just hear from your perspective the Grapevine journey, when you joined and what you do as a business.
So we're about to turn 35 as a business. I'm not sure we've got time to cover all 35 years today, so I'll give you the condensed version. Grapevine started in 1991, around the time that mobile phones were becoming a more common commodity, both in business and in the consumer market. And Brian, who founded the company and then brought Pete on board, had some experience in the mobile industry as it was coming up through its infancy, and decided to start his own business, which became Grapevine. Now, that ran for about, I guess, 10 years through the 90s as mobile was becoming more of a prominent thing. And then they realized that there was a bit of a change going on in that sector, and that a lot of the networks were actually planning to open their own retail stores. So Brian and Pete sold the chain that we had built up across the South and Southwest, and decided to go more predominantly B2B. And that didn't really need the on the high street front shop window for businesses. So obviously there was a big cost saving there with that. So yeah, moved more into the B2B space. Then over the next 10 years, got closer towards the advent of cloud telephony and VoIP phone systems. So it became a more broad sort of holistic telecoms provider. And then when I joined the business in September 2015, it was about a week before we acquired an IT company. So they could see that the writing was on the wall, really, in terms of IT and telecoms beginning to merge. So the 10 years that I've been involved in the business that bring us up to where we are today have been very much merging those two in terms of what we have going on behind the scenes, but also in terms of the offering that we have for our clients, who may be at different stages. Some may still have a legacy IT provider, some may have a legacy telecoms provider, but doing our best to become a one-stop shop for our clients.
Sure. And you were in academia, I think, before joining Grapevine, is that right?
I was.
What was your own personal background?
That's how I got to know Grapevine, actually. So I graduated from Bournemouth University. I did a degree in advertising and marketing communications, as it was back then, and there was an opportunity to come on board in a role about, I guess, a few months after I graduated, to help one of the academic groups there set up a commercial arm to the group there, to work with both local businesses to provide marketing consultancy for the type of businesses that maybe wouldn't be able to go straight to a marketing agency, may not have those budgets, and may need a little bit of hand holding in terms of knowing what it was that they were actually going to ask for in terms of support from a third party. So there was that side of it. At the other end of the scale, we were doing a lot of outsourced research coming from agencies that were predominantly London-based, that had much bigger clients like ITV, Channel 4, Toyota, Samsung, to name a few, who liked the academic perspective that the university could provide. So I had an interesting role because I would be at ITV with their heads of research one day, and then on an industrial estate in rural Dorset the next. But I loved that mix. It was fantastic. And Grapevine were one of the regional clients that I had. They had a KTP project previously, which stands for Knowledge Transfer Partnership. So they already had a relationship with the university and were looking to do more once their KTP associate had emigrated to the US. Again, I'm probably going into a bit more detail than perhaps your listeners need to hear, but it explains how I came to know Grapevine, because essentially I was doing a lot of outsourced bits and pieces to help bridge that gap between their KTP associate emigrating and what came next. Now, I didn't expect that would be me joining the business, but things changed at the university. There were shiftings of budgets and stuff, and the opportunity came up to work in-house, which I did initially part-time whilst I was still doing some teaching at Bournemouth University. And then in 2016, I joined Grapevine full-time because things were beginning to pick up as we'd acquired the IT firm, and there was a bit more that was required of me at that stage. So I thought, why not give it a go and see. I hadn't had a traditional marketing role at that point, other than the marketing that I was doing for the scheme at BU. So yeah, made that jump across to Grapevine, still maintaining some good links with the university, still regularly there today. And yeah, that's sort of how I came into working with Grapevine. So it was a really unusual route into the business, and I still for a while sort of saw them as a client more so than as an employer, because of that relationship that we'd had previously. But it gave me a unique dynamic with the team there, because I felt that I could act somewhat impartially, because I already had that relationship with them as a business. And I think that probably lent itself quite well when we came to the EO transition, because I still felt as if Grapevine wasn't mine per se, and that I was supporting them in what they were attempting to achieve with the business. And then we became employee owned. It sort of finally changed that for me to feel like I was, I had a stake in the business. But I still feel. Almost like one cog in the machine, rather than having total oversight of what's going on there.
Sure. And so when you joined the company, was there any discussion around the future of the company in terms of succession, when the directors were going to step down? Any thoughts of conversations around trade sales and EO? What was the sort of discussions in the early days, and then what led up to the decision to go employee owned in March 2023?
I'd say there certainly wasn't when I first joined. Brian had recently retired when I actually came into the role in-house. I'd known Brian when they first became a client of mine, so I had a bit of a relationship with him, but didn't know him as well as, say, James Spinks, who was the sales director at that time, and Pete, who was managing director. By about 2019, 2020, it had reached a point where there was some talk of what the future might look like. We'd managed to go through that transition of bringing the IT business on board and integrating that team, and then it was where do we go next? What's the next steps on this? Then I think COVID derailed those thoughts quite massively, and I think, as all of us probably felt in March 2020, who knows who of us is going to come out of this either as employees or as businesses? It was just so unclear at that point, wasn't it? So I guess we got back to a sense of normality somewhat, I think, by about 2022. And then towards the end of 2022, it felt as if a lot of decisions were being put on hold, and it wasn't quite clear why. I began to have some concerns about what may happen, but by very early into 2023, the announcement was made that we were becoming employee owned, and that was quite a big sigh of relief, actually, but also really exciting because I was aware of EO through Salad, who were a client of ours. They'd become EO a couple of years earlier, and it sounded like a really cool thing to do and a great fit for Grapevine. I just I don't know why I never expected it was going to happen. And now we're 3 years in. It does seem like such a logical fit for us. I think we were quite well suited to employee ownership in terms of the nature and the culture of the business. It just I don't know. Is Someone said to me once that things take a long time to happen, and then when they do, they happen really quickly. You're surprised how quickly it does, and I'd say that was true with Grapevine. It didn't look like anything major was going to happen, and then it did.
Yeah. Was there much explanation given to you as the leadership team or as the business as to why the decision had gone down the way it did in terms of deciding to go down the route of employee ownership as opposed to trade sale? Was that ever formally explained, or was it just almost presented as this is what we've done and this is all the good reasons for doing it?
A bit of both, I'd
Right.
say. A fair amount of the latter because it was a decision that had been made, and they were looking to make the completion within a matter of days from when we were told. But the explanation that was given was you couldn't argue with it really. With the as you alluded to in the intro, the number of people that had been with the business for as many years as they had, it just made sense to both secure their futures, but also reward them for the amount of time that they put into the business. And I think at that stage there perhaps wasn't a clear or obvious, you know, option of who could they sell this to in the company as individuals. So EO was the second best option, I guess, in that respect, in terms of making sure that it stayed in safe and familiar hands. I would argue that actually it's the better option, personally. But yeah, I didn't question it at all when we were told. I was just so excited at that point, really, because I think after a couple of years of, yeah, probably we all felt a bit like this as marketeers during the pandemic of not really knowing what to say or to who or to what extent, because it was just really hard to know what would land at that time. So I'd really been treading water, I felt, for a couple of years. So I was sort of rubbing my hands when they told us about the EO thing. So I was like, this is great. This is like a new chapter for the business's story, and something for me to go back out to the local business community and further afield to kind of try and put us back on the map, because I think we'd fallen off quite a bit.
Right. And how did it generally land once the news broke? Were you told individually, or did the directors get you all together? What was the communication process around the actual announcement and what that meant? Because I guess for certain people, they immediately scurry away and start looking at what does it actually mean to become employee owned, because it is a concept that maybe not everybody understands. How was that communication piece done, and what as the head of communications in the business?
So we were told individually. I wouldn't say that was the case for everyone in the company, but it may be that some of our frontline teams were told as a group. But I know for a fact that those of us that have been with the company for a fair period of time, and I guess at that stage I'd been there for 7 or 8 years, we were told individually and given the opportunity to ask questions, and sort of have an in-depth conversation about it all. My role shifted quite a bit at that stage. I was, on paper, marketing manager up until that stage, and still was immediately after the transition. But I was invited to be a part of what then was called our employee forum, which consisted of me, my colleague Donna Fletcher, who'd been with the company since she joined as an apprentice in '93, and Ross Eno, who had joined us, I think, the year before. So he was relatively new to it. And we kind of put together this, well, they put together this team sort of cherry picked, knowing that they had a good mix there of old, new, and somewhere in the middle, which was me, but also that I was bringing that communications skill set to really sort of reinvent our internal comms, because until then most of what I was doing was more external facing. I often joke that I would see more of the people that I would see at networking events than I did of my colleagues, because I was just a lot more outward facing in terms of my role. The employee forum helped us for a period of time to get across what was changing in the business, what that looked like for people, helping to deal with any questions or any concerns that people had, and just kind of supporting the board of directors, which at that point shrunk from 5 to 2, with that communications piece there. I think after a while of doing that, I realised that my role had shifted, and that I wasn't doing so much of a traditional marketing role anymore. So I came up with this job title of communications and engagement manager, in part to kind of recognise the broader mix of what I was doing, both internally but also externally, because I was doing a lot more in terms of communicating and conveying what employee ownership was, what it meant, what we could offer to the communities that we were part of, than just being more product and solution focused, which I'd say my role was a bit more prior to the transition.
Right. In terms of, it was a big change, I guess, in terms of ownership structure, but it also felt, from what you've just said, like a big change in leadership structure. You had 5 directors, you're down to 2. Did the 3 immediately leave the business at the point of becoming employee owned? And then how was the leadership team, because I know you then joined the leadership, you were part of the formal leadership team. How did that process take place? And again, for listeners of the podcast, any particular areas of that worked really well, or we do it differently next time? How did that whole leadership transition process work?
So Brian and his partner Hilary, they were retired anyway. When we made the transition to EO, they stepped down from the board immediately, as did Pete. The only difference with Pete's role is that he then became a consultant for the business, mostly because of his client base that he had, and that we didn't want to alienate that audience too much immediately, because it would have been quite a sudden change for him to have left the business entirely. So he's still working with us. He's slowly working towards his well-earned retirement, but he's doing some great work helping us to bridge that gap with those businesses that are predominantly based in the Southwest. So where most of our operations have now centralised to our office in Poole, we still have a satellite office just outside of Bath, which is where Donna, who I mentioned before, our other director, Ed Lewis, and Pete, a couple of days a week are based. So for that first year, as we found our feet, as I say, it was just the 2 directors, and still is. But I think we realised that they needed more support, because they, as we keep saying, they went from 5 to 2. So I think it was late 2024, going into 2025, because we announced this, I think, our AGM last March. We'd formed a senior management team, and that consists of the 2 directors, myself, Donna, and our other colleague, Ed Shaw, who's been in the company for, I'm going to get this wrong, I think he's been with the company for 28 years, but I'm supposed to be the company historian, and I'm pretty good at it, but off the cuff I can't quite remember. I'm sure he'll listen to this at some point and resent me for not remembering, but it must be nearly 30 years.
Sure. And what was the process leading up to that transition? Had you, it's a new team, you've got quite a lot of a number of directors that were quite key to the business perhaps in the past. How did that transition take place in terms of, was there a formal coaching program for you in terms of taking over and running the business. How did you all feel at that time when the announcement was made? Clearly that then precipitated further leadership changes. Was the training in place? Did you all feel able and confident to take on the leadership of the business from those that had previously set it up?
I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but I think possibly the employee forum that was established was a kind of um, on-the-job training
Like an
exercise for
incubator.
Donna and I. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so, because it was really difficult because, as you know, there is no definitive rule book. I used to say there is no rule book, but people have written rule books. There just isn't a definitive one, is there? And neither was there for how we would do our employee forum, or even that we had to have one. I think it was recommended to us that it might be a good idea. I know other businesses have councils or similar functions, but we didn't really know quite what we needed to do. And so Don and I, who we hadn't actually been that close. We hadn't worked that closely together before, and it was a really good opportunity to get to know her as a colleague. Um, because we found that we just started to pick up some rocks that hadn't been picked up in the business for a long time and have a peek at what was underneath. And it's surprising what you find, good and bad sometimes. But there was a lot of things that just hadn't been addressed in the business for a long period of time. So we were finding that we were getting quite in the depths of looking into those things, and then began to run consultations with individual members of staff as kind of one-to-ones or two-to-ones, if you prefer, to just sound everybody out a little bit to see where they were at, because we hadn't really had a sort of formal appraisal function across the board in the business for a few years. Again, something that sort of fell to the side during COVID, really, where we were all kind of fragmented and working in different places, mostly from home. So we spoke to people, and we heard their thoughts and their concerns, and and their ideas for the business, and started to consolidate those and kind of create a collated report of views and themes and ideas across the business. And very quickly, we realised this doesn't feel like we are supposed to be doing this, and we were sort of having a little bit of imposter syndrome, because we felt that we were overstepping the mark a little bit in terms of what our remit was as a forum. For Ross, who was a new member of staff, I think it was difficult for him to kind of come on that journey with us, because he just wouldn't have had the confidence, or and I'm talking about Don and I having limited confidence in some of what we were doing there. So yeah, it was difficult at times, and you sort of felt a little bit concerned when you were going to the board of directors with some of this stuff that we'd gone away and uncovered, because some of it was difficult listening, and some of it was an ideas factory that we perhaps didn't have the resource to be able to respond to. So yeah, it was a bit of a balancing act, but I think it very quickly gave us that crash course in what a senior role might look like. So when we got to the end of our tenure, and we plotted that we would do 2 years in the employee forum and then let that cycle on to somebody else. So when we finished that, I guess it put us in a good position to be able to step into the senior management roles. And Ed, our other colleague, he is on the board of trustees as well. So he'd had a similar experience to us, but on that side of things. So yeah, I guess we were a logical set of three to add into that senior management team.
Interesting. That takes us nicely into sort of the whole corporate governance and how the business is now run as opposed to how it was run before. And you've mentioned that the trust board was introduced. What's the structure now? How does that work in terms of main board, trust board, sort of partner council? What's the structure, and do you think it's working as well as you would like it to be at the moment?
I think we've relaxed the structure somewhat in the last couple of years. I think as we came into this, I think we were almost a bit too regimented with it, because again, you sort of feel like you need to be doing this the unwritten but considered correct way. So of course, we still have a board of trustees, which consists of a rotating role for one of the founders, which would either be Brian, Pete, or Brian's wife Hilary, and they do a year each, and it sort of cycles between the three of them. We've got an external trustee who is our company accountant, and Ed Shaw, my colleague, who is our employee representative on that board. Then we've got the board of directors, which consists of James, our managing director, and Ed Lewis, our technical director. We disbanded the forum because when Don and I had finished our tour of duty, so to speak, on that, it was difficult to know who to pass the reins on to. So we pivoted a little bit and had a social committee for a year or so to kind of maintain that culture part of it. And now we're at a stage where we're looking to what that next evolution might be. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the best laid plans, every time we think we've got that set up correct, we turn another page in this book and start a new chapter and realize that it needs to evolve again to kind of be fit for purpose. And as we as we near the end of paying the deferred consideration, I think we kind of want to get that right for what that needs to look like when we've reached financial freedom, and almost not trying to reinvent the wheel too much at this stage, because we probably want to change what that looks like again once we get to that point. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's given us a perfect view of how the business is governed. And in terms of the sort of topics, I'm not sure if you'd be familiar, in terms of topics that the trust board have looked at and are looking at. How does the governance between the main board and the trust board work, that sort of relationship? And are you essentially just relying on the reserved matters in the trust deed in terms of things that the trust board sign off on, or are there additional powers that you've sort of given to the trust board to make sure that they are genuinely being responsible for sort of putting the beneficiary owners first and foremost?
I'd say that's probably a corner of the business that I don't know too much about.
Sure. Okay.
Having not been involved with either board discussions, but I would say that it's probably fairly relaxed, as I was saying before, in terms of that relationship between the two boards. I mean, being a company of 24, it's not a huge business to have to govern. And I think that relationship that we have with our external trustee, who, as I say, is our company accountant, Ed, who's been with the business for a number of years, and the rotating founder role, I think they've got a fairly good handle on what's happening in the business day to day generally. And probably those trustee meetings at the moment are fairly straightforward in terms of just keeping a watchful eye over what's happening in the company. But I don't think we've had much of concern or of particular note in our journey so far. The only thing that we have had is a couple of issues relating to just changes with our accounting and stuff that maybe made a bit of work for those teams in the last couple of years. But pleased to report that that's all been addressed now. So yeah, I guess the question for us is, again, it's reaching that point of financial freedom of then saying, right, what do we want the board to be able to do for the company, and starting to figure that out a little bit more, looking forward rather than where we're at currently.
In terms of, you mentioned Financial Freedom Day, you're in a fortunate position if you've got that insight, because for a lot of EO businesses that still feels like quite a long way off. But are you starting to discuss within the business what that looks like and what the implications for the business are once you hit that magical date?
I think it's becoming a bit of an informal shopping list at the moment of things that we'd like to do once we have that money to invest in the business. I guess one of the big things is in terms of future dividends, profit share for the team, and making sure that while we are championing that as a reason why we're doing this, and encouraging people to to stay on board with the company in terms of the benefits that are down the line. Also trying to work out what's the trade-off in terms of paying out versus investing in the business to ensure the quality of work-life experience is good for our team. We don't want to grow the company to triple figures in terms of our headcount, but it might be nice to have 5 to 10 more people within the next few years, which we would be able to afford to start to look to do. Now, that number of people would ease some of the pressures on our teams, but also, opportunities like 9-day working fortnights may be an option. So it's trying to figure out, what's important to the team, and starting to have those initial conversations with people, because as much as financially, I'm sure we'd all appreciate that bonus each year if possible. If it's at the expense of our working lives, then yeah, I think that needs to be considered, and I think we're starting to communicate that to the team through our regular correspondence, and also our annual meeting that we have with our co-owners, which we just had beginning of this month, to map out what that looks like, what those potential scenarios are, so that they're not sat there thinking for the next couple of years, we've got big payouts coming our way, because it may be that doesn't suit everyone or the majority of people, and that we need to be a bit more nuanced in what does work for the whole team.
Yeah, it is a really interesting one. I don't think, as you have said a few times, that there is no real EO playbook, albeit I guess there's a developing best practice out there. But yeah, when you get to that point in time, I guess in the absence of good communication, which is your skill set, there could definitely be an assumption that, well, they know what's being paid out by way of DC at the moment, just divide that by 24, happy days, we're all going to get super bonuses. But as you quite rightly say, being paid more is one thing, but actually if people are still having to, I don't know, come in at weekends or stay behind in the evenings and stuff, actually bringing in additional team members may certainly be the right way to go. And I do think there'll be a developing sort of body of knowledge around how to do Financial Freedom Day well. And certainly some of the conversations I've had with a few businesses that are either there or rapidly approaching it, it's looking at it from a number of different sort of stakeholder perspectives. So maybe an amount gets allocated to sort of bonuses and benefits, which is clearly one of the benefits of being employee owned. But also, certainly in our business, it's focusing on building our fortress balance sheet, as we call it, at Paradigm Norton. So, making sure that we've got the reserves to weather the storms. And then clearly, new CEO or the leadership team coming in, they're also wanting to grow the business, and it's how you hold all those three areas in tension. And I think there's a careful balance there, but there isn't a lot of actually information out there on how you do that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that transpires in Grapevine. Often in EO businesses, we talk quite a lot about owner mindset. And what does it really mean? How does an EO business differ to a non-EO business? And probably you've given that quite a bit of thought as a comms and engagement manager. But in terms of if we were to speak to some of your team today, do you think they feel the business now feels quite different to how it did in 22 or in the lead up to 2023? Has there been significant changes where people genuinely feel, I do now feel like an owner, I feel more engaged, more able to put forward ideas, or, as often is the case, that may have well been the culture of Grapevine before you became a EO? Has there been a change? And what are the sort of things that you, as the comms and engagement manager, are looking to do to get that high level of engagement and start to see some of the outcomes that we know can come through as a result of being employee owned in terms of productivity, efficiency, engagement, etc.?
I think we're getting there. I think if you were able to show everyone a snapshot of where we were in 2022 versus today, I think they'd see the difference. I wonder, and looking at this on a individual by individual basis, whether everybody has noticed how far we've come in that respect, because I think it has been quite incremental. I think out the gate with the transition, you're very excited, or you have some people in the business that are very excited that get it immediately. That then for everyone else, it's a bit like, they're watching you run around, championing what has happened, but they haven't quite got there themselves yet, and they need to see some of the change happening before they can imagine what further change might look like. And this is where I perhaps need to be paying uh, a, a what's the word I'm looking for? An amount of money to Bella from Salad. A royalty is the word I'm looking for the advice that she gave me when we first spoke post transition about you need to do things differently for people to realize that something has changed. And that has been the mantra that's been rolling around in my head for the last 3 years. And the problem is you can't do too much change at once because it will just freak people out. And I think we at times did try to do that, did get mixed results, and kind of had to go back to the drawing board. Whereas I think now we've had the 3 years, and my God, how quickly that time's gone. We've done lots of bits and pieces along the way, and sort of incrementally, built that up to the point that, yeah, when I look at it now and the kind of the suite of things that we do as an EO business in terms of, our annual group meetings, which again for a company of 24 seems a bit grandiose, really. And we don't call it that; we call it the co-owners annual meeting. But it's funny this year people have started to refer to it as the AGM. So I think they're getting it. They're getting what it's supposed to resemble, even if we're doing it in our own sort of slightly more humble way. Um, so yeah, it is taking time with it, and I think there's been points where we've been frustrated, and I think we've got to a stage now where we're kind of saying to ourselves, look, just don't be frustrated about this. Don't be disappointed because we have achieved a lot, and there are some challenges that we still face in terms of bringing people on board with how excited the rest of us are. But focus on the positives. Some people will sadly never get this, and not to worry about that because if anything, it only dampens your own enthusiasm, and but at the same time not to stop doing the things that we're doing because we're doing them because it's the right thing to do. We if everyone had turned up to the co-owners meeting at the beginning of the month and been, nonchalant about it and hadn't had anything to say after, then the gut reaction might have been, do we bother doing it next year? No, we're definitely going to do it next year because next year might be different. By next year, a few more people may have clicked for them, or fortunately, we did a very good response this year, and hopefully we'll have an even better response next year. So it's just it's being in it for the long game yourselves. Do you know if you are one of the people that are enthusiastic about it, that understand it from the outset, is just realizing that there's going to be days where you do question, is it just me? Is it, and unfortunately, I know it's not just me in our business, but I expect there are some other examples where, because of the nature of the company and the work that they do, it may just not resonate with teams. So yeah, sorry, I've probably gone off on a few tangents there, Barry.
No,
But
that's really interesting. I mean, your co-owners meeting is an interesting one. What sort of information do you communicate there? Is that quite transparent in terms of P&L? This is how the business is doing, really giving the beneficial owners a real sense of, yes, we are owners, and quite rightly we need the information. So that's one question, is around what you communicate, and secondly, communication preferences or styles is, I think, is often an interesting one. Again, here we do insights profiles, and if I'm thinking about the blues, those that love spreadsheets and the detail, they want information presented possibly in a different way to the greens and the yellows, the people, the ones that are more people focused. How do you communicate information in Grapevine, and how do you essentially tailor it to different people's sort of preferences?
So in terms of the co-owner meeting, we've done 3 of those now. The first one was an hour long, and we managed to condense everything into an hour, which was quite nice and punchy and worked well. The second year, we got a bit ahead of ourselves and tried to incorporate updates from every area of the business, and it just felt a bit bloated. So this year we scaled it back to really kind of get to those key bits, because I think you can overload people with information. And last year I think we it went to about 2.5 hours long. We got it back to an hour again this year, because and that may seem like a almost impossible task to boil down a whole year's activity in an hour, and it is, but that's okay, because you can have appendices and and stuff that go into further information, and that's kind of been a bit of the approach that we've had now with sharing information. We used to each month send around the profit and loss report, but I'm not a numbers person. I'm not a blue category person. I'm not sure what color category I am, but I'm words more than numbers. So for me, I need to be told, what do these numbers mean? A spreadsheet of numbers is just blinding for me, unfortunately. So we have things like, we have a progress bar on the main intranet page that everyone has on their browser every time they open their browser at Grapevine, and it shows like a loading bar for like a download, and obviously there's a little bit of an IT connection there. How far we are on the transfer rate for paying off the deferred consideration. And every time we get a little bit further, we add another bar onto that thing. So it's looking like a download from 2002, when it took forever to download one song. So it is going slowly, but it's getting there. But everyone's seeing that every time they're opening their browser. So it's little things like that. And then if people want the further information, we can provide that too. We don't hide away any of that stuff. It's there for people that want it, but we're almost giving the digestible part of it. And then if there are people that are keen to know more, they're quite welcome to know the majority of what's going on across the business, within reason. Obviously, there's some stuff that's confidential that relates to individuals, but yeah, it's just making sure that we don't throw the whole kitchen sink at people, and instead just give them the pieces that we think are most key for them to continue to sort of look ahead with where we're going. But I mean, I sent a Monday email, which started as a quarterly email and then somehow became weekly. But I'm glad of it, and I don't think I've missed many weeks since we started. I think the only ones that we do is we have a break over the Christmas period, when there's just not really a lot to say other than Merry Christmas, have a nice few days off.
And what goes
But
into your weekly update? What sort of stuff are you communicating across the business there?
sort of anything I can find, really. And sometimes, as with any news outlet, there are quiet news weeks. And if that's the case, I have a bank of regular things that is worth updating people on, or reminding people of, how to raise an issue or an idea in the business. Things like our volunteering days, that everybody has an extra day of annual leave to dedicate to a charity or worthwhile cause that they want to support, things like that, so that it never goes out and feels empty. But the other stuff that will come up will be, I'm trying to think in what was in this week's edition. So we had some good press coverage from our colleague George, who'd done a guest talk that had made our local Echo, which was brilliant, because we don't always get a lot of press coverage in the local newspaper, so that was good. It had a invite to Sam Moles's EO Knowledge Share, which is coming up next week, I think it is, at the time of talking. Though probably by the time people hear this, there'll probably be another one, because he does them each month. But yeah, inviting our team to that. And then there's an in-person event that Salad and Coda are hosting, and inviting people to attend that as well. Now, our take-up is never 100% across the board on those things, but it's important to us that we include those opportunities for people to go along to these events. So that's why they're included there. In other weeks, it might be a reminder of some of our health benefits that we have, and some of the discount platforms that we've got access to. So it's quite a broad mix of, news stories, but also reminders of things that we're doing as a business that are either benefits or part of the overall mission of employee ownership.
Sure. Do you do team surveys from time to time in the business to sort of gauge where you're at in terms of engagement with various things? Is that something that you routinely do in the business?
Yeah, we did one after the AGM last year. There was a lot of questions that we wanted at that point to ask people, in some ways to gauge where their understanding was of EO, but also of how the business was performing. But this was the one that we snuck the question into: what do you value about Grapevine? And that was always done deliberately with one mind on: we're going to use these responses for developing our co-owner charter. But we knew that if we'd gone to people and said that we're going to do this charter, what do you want to have on it? It might have just uh, paralyzed people a little bit in terms of knowing what to contribute or what to suggest. So we asked that question almost quite calmly, quite, it was in the mix of everything else that was there, in hope that we would get a fairly genuine response from people. And the responses that we got were probably the best responses that we've had to any question we've ever included in the survey. So we were lucky that we had some good stuff there to work with. And then what I did was basically went through all of the responses and looked for the common themes and wrote, I think, about 7 or 8 points that made the co-owner charter. We didn't do a survey immediately after the AGM this year for time reasons, but we will do another one at some point, probably as we reach, as we lead up to EO Day. I think that will be the sort of time frame of that. We don't want to do too much at once, and doing the survey immediately after the AGM was just a lot happening at once for everybody. But we want to include a question that now says, please review the co-owner charter. Is there anything that you feel that we've missed, or that anything that you feel that should be amended in the charter? So I think that will provide an annual opportunity for us to update that too. We published the charter on EO Day last year, and I think the intention will be that if there is a revised edition, that it will be an EO Day release again this year.
What led up to what was the catalyst for the charter? And I know when we chatted, you thought that was quite a significant part of you winning the award, the actual formation of bringing this charter together. So just for listeners, what was the catalyst for it, and what is it, and what benefit have you seen in the business? I mean, you've already mentioned that, but has it achieved the outcome that you hoped it would?
There were two things. The first one relates back to the consultation that Donna and I did when we were running the forum, which is when we spoke to everybody, and I wrote down what they were saying and kind of created a document that gave an overview of what was important to people across the business, and if there were any concerns or things that they felt that we should be doing, that was included in that too. But the problem was I went a bit too academic on it, and it was difficult for anyone to really digest, probably myself included. And when we then asked people to kind of rank the themes that were included in that, I just think people were a bit baffled by the kind of overload of it all. So I knew that had sort of worked, but hadn't quite got to where I wanted it to be. So that was sort of on the bench, so to speak. Then we happened to see that Rubicon, who another EO business based down here in Poole, they had in their foyer I think it's called House Rules. And when we were at the conference and won the award, I mistakenly referred to it as their 10 Commandments, which it's not. It's not quite that heavy-handed, shall we say. But it is a consensus on what is important to them as a company. What do they? It's the visions and values thing. And I'd heard a lot of companies talking about needing to establish their visions and values, and I'd even given a guest talk for Bournemouth University on our visions and values, and they were the participants in the course were writing their visions and values, and they were looking for me to give some insight on what they should write. And I had to say, look, we don't have that articulated or documented in any way. When you are a small company, you kind of know what the visions and values are, and yeah, it felt to me that every time I saw a set of them written out by a company, they all just look quite vanilla. Do you know what I mean? And maybe they should be. Maybe there should be some common factors across all businesses. But I don't know. I feel like you could just change the names or the branding on each set that I'd seen, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish one from the next. So I knew that we had to do something around that. I liked what Rubicon had done because it felt a little bit more authentic, a little bit more genuine, a little bit more them. But we didn't want to copy them exactly because that would have been unfair. So we took a fair amount of inspiration from what they did there, and I'd say probably met in the middle from the kind of the very wordy academic thing that I've done before and their very succinct set of rules that they have, and came up with the charter, which we want to put it on a wall, but the problem is it is still a bit too wordy. So we've got to find a way to kind of present that in a way that, I don't know, maybe it just needs like an infographic or something like that that represents the different points, because I don't want to just put a wall of text on one of our walls in the building. It just feels, from a design perspective, it feels a little bit strange to do that. But yeah, I'm really happy with where we got to with it. And someone asked the question once, have we had to use it to put anybody up on not adhering to what the charter is? And unfortunately, we hadn't at that point, and we still haven't. And I hope we don't have to, because I don't see the charter as being a contract with the company. People have an employment contract for a reason, and that there's certain things that we hope people adhere to in that, and disciplinary procedures if they don't. The charter is more a contract that the individual is making with themselves, and the rest of the team, to be a good team player, to kind of you know recognize EO and practice good EO, and I think for even still some of our team, once you put that EO badge on it, sometimes it does kind of feel a little bit inaccessible to them. Folks that haven't been to an EOA event or the conference, it still mystifies it a little bit. And I think that's why we were quite keen to have the co-owner term become something that people recognize internally, and for this to be something that has a nod to EO, but we'd almost look to do it regardless of whether we had become EO or not. Do you know what I mean? It would have taken that place of having a visions and values set articulated. I just prefer this approach to a, I don't know, a design by committee and boardroom set of visions and values that people haven't been involved with. This is a co-created document, and hopefully everyone that said something in that survey can see a piece of that in this document, whether I've quite articulated it as they meant it or not.
You've talked quite a bit about co-owners, and for me that goes to the importance of language. And I often talk about that we've never really talked about staff or employees, but I always reference employee owners because that's what they are. Has there been any other changes of language that you've introduced into Grapevine to try and just reinforce that we are all in this together, we are all genuine owners? Or is that the main thing you talk about when you put meetings and things together, like your co-owner meetings and things like that?
We had a phrase that we, you're just reminding me of this now, and I wonder what happened to it, because it was quite good, but it almost felt a little bit negatively. I'd say it felt a bit preschool. Positively, it felt a bit Ted Lasso. I don't know if you've seen the show Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
But we kind of wanted to have just a real simple sentence that was "we" includes me, right? Because that was the bit that I think people were missing at the beginning of our transition, is that when we talk about us as a company, often folks were imagining a set of people, and I guess that goes back to when the company was run by the owners of the business, as it were, then, that it was their business. So people were working for them, perhaps more so than working for the business. So we had to kind of like break down, like dissolve this idea that when you say we, that you are part of that we is not like happening in another room or another office or another set of people that you're not part of. So that was something that we were using for a little bit, and maybe we ought to bring it back, because I think it's quite good. Simple, but Yeah, I guess the concern was, is it being a bit patronizing to people? And I think we've got to a better place with that now. I mean, I was just in the office yesterday, and I'm amazed at how, little bits of upkeep around the office are just happening. And I feel bad because I deliberately try not to get involved, because I want other people to feel that they can contribute too. And again, I'm someone that's in the middle of this. I wasn't a owner of the business, and I'm part of the senior team, but I'm in the same position as everybody else in this as a co-owner, so I should be contributing on these matters as much as they are. But if I kept stepping up through my excitement and enthusiasm for this, I'd almost be doing them a disservice. That suits me because it means that I can be lazy and sit on my seat whilst everyone's doing the upkeep of the office. But I sit there and I'm proud of it. I'm proud that people are doing these things. A colleague from I was based on the ground floor. A colleague from the first floor came down and said, "Oh, I've got the replacement legs for the sofa." I thought, brilliant! Like he recognised that there was an issue with one of the sofas that we've got in our lounge in the office, and ordered a new set and was going to fit them. There was an issue with the front door. Somebody else had ordered the WD-40, and one of them was going out to spray the door. Like, these are all things that are starting to happen by clockwork now. They weren't a year or 2 years ago. We were still having to be quite top down. And I know this fits the category of kind of teas and toilets that is jokingly referred to within the EO community of, it's more than all these things, but it is also these things. These are the bits and pieces around the space that we occupy throughout the week that do need to be maintained and kept up together. But regardless of what they are, it's the fact that people are feeling that sense of ownership of it. So yeah, I've gone off on a tangent, sorry, but back to the language thing. Yeah, that was, I think at that point we felt that we needed that sentence to try and reinforce it. And I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but the co-owners one was a big one. And I mean, we pretty much, to the point of it becoming propaganda, we've used co-owners everywhere on everything. It gets that branding, just to reinforce it.
It does take a while, though, I think, in terms of you do need to do a lot in terms of bringing these changes. I think that's important. Often a lot is said about the impact of becoming employee owned in terms of engagement, performance of the business. Have you seen an uptick in terms of performance at Grapevine since 2023 as a result of that, what you've just talked about, really, which is that deeper engagement, people going, don't worry, I'll sort that out? Has that come through in revenue and profitability, or have there been other more challenging issues out in the world that we see today that have led to revenues and profits and things going the other way? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a bit of feast and famine in the last few years, which is, in some ways, I mean, obviously, we'd all like to have permanent feast, wouldn't we? But it's been quite good to teach everybody what business looks like. We had a really good first year. Now, that was because of the knock-on effect from COVID. A lot of our proposals that we had in the field were being sat on for maybe a year or two, and then a lot of that business landed in 2023. So from the point of transition, we grew as a business in terms of our turnover, a fair amount in that first year, and we're able to pay a profit share at the end of the first year, which again was great to be able to immediately show that there's those benefits. Then the second year, it was just like everything kind of got thrown at us that year. In terms of, we work with a lot of third parties in terms of the services that we provide. Some of them are very big organizations, and I think from time to time they feel the pinch of the economy, and that then has a knock-on effect on us. So we got to the end of our second year, and it was a bit like, blimey, we've sort of managed to get through, but it wasn't as plain sailing as the year before. Now it's flipped again, and the last year that we've just had has been brilliant, and our turnover has grown again. So I guess hopefully the people that have been on that journey from when we first transitioned to now can see not necessarily a pattern, but can see that there's peaks and troughs to this, and that some years are going to be better than others. And if you divide the good times out across all the years, then we're doing okay. We're able to pay a profit share this year just gone. If you combine those 2 years and divide it across three, everyone's still done okay for 3 years there. But I think the key thing for us is that it's probably given us a sort of renewed confidence in terms of our position as a business. I think we were, as I said, we'd fallen off the map a little bit in terms of people knowing who we were and that we were here and what we do. And I think that was in part because Grapevine had been around for so long. I mean, when you've been in business for 30 years, I always joke that you sort of become like wallpaper. People have known you and known you long enough to forget you. And if you don't have something new to say, you just kind of get forgotten about. So it's given us something to go back out with. I think the EO story is such a positive one, and we've had some fantastic wins along the way with obviously the award at the end of last year. We actually won a best place to work award within our first year, so that sort of helped with the momentum. So even when we had that tough year in between in 2024, we still had some good stories and some good just goodwill, I guess, from our contacts locally. That there's a buzz around the business again. And without giving exact figures, I can see that translating to inquiries. For years messing around with search engine optimization and all these little tips and tricks of things that you think this will do it. This will be the one that suddenly we see an uptick in inquiries for our website. And lo and behold, it took transitioning the whole business to a totally different model to kind of crack that, really. And I guess the concern that I've got now is, what happens when this part of the story becomes wallpaper? Do you know, that we may be reaching the end of being able to tell this story, and what's the next one that we tell? So hopefully, as we get to the point of completing and hitting financial freedom, then we can think a bit more about, okay, what story do we tell now? What do we do as a business now? And I think the it's not a niche per se, but I think the thing we've discovered and a lot of companies are discovering is that it's reimagining what a business can be and what it can mean to people that are employed by it, isn't it? What we do is so, I mean, crikey, I think the introduction of Chat GPT at the end of 2022 was quite well timed with everything else that happened here, because immediately the era of content creation in terms of everyone trying to position themselves as being an expert in their field got turned on its head, didn't it? Anyone could write the same article that you're going to write about a product or solution at the click of a button. So immediately it just made me think, well, why bother? And I abandoned a strategy that we were working on to build this knowledge hub for our clients, because it's like, it's everywhere. This information is everywhere. And crikey, we don't even get past Google now, do we? Because we just look at the AI search result and that gives us our answer for things. So what are we saying as a business, and what are we offering beyond the actual service that we offer? And I think employee ownership was a really good fit, but there's other things that we've explored in the last few years, things like living wage affiliation, signing the Armed Forces Covenant, to commit to employing people that have left the forces. All little things like that are out there. B Corp is one that we keep sort of looking at and thinking, are we going to go for it? Maybe we will. But things like that become stories to tell as a business. But as well as having that benefit of giving you something to talk about, you're actually doing some good whilst it's not greenwashing. You're not just saying it so that you've got a nice PR piece. You're actually doing that work too. We've increased the amount of work that we do with charities, partly through these volunteering days that everybody has, which was introduced in 2023. But also, we have a charity that we're supporting who have they take a percentage of the SIM cards that we sell that are branded with our own name on. Things like that. It's for a marketer, like it's just made my job to be honest with you, quite easy
Right.
because
Yeah.
these are good stories
Yeah, they are.
to tell.
Yeah, very powerful. Yeah, I mean, we've been a B Corp, you probably should know, for a long time. So maybe that's another conversation we can have on another day. But certainly for us, I think being a B Corp and the sort of 5 pillars that you've got to work on over time lends itself beautifully to an employee-owned business. I think the two sort of models fit incredibly well together. You've been really open and honest. I've really enjoyed our conversation. There's a question I typically ask towards the end, which is there anything that you, coming onto the podcast, knowing it was a Steak and Soul EO podcast, thought Barry's bound to ask me that and we haven't covered it? Is there anything in Grapevine that you do that you think for listeners, well, we should just talk about that as we wrap up the podcast, or have we pretty much covered what you envisaged we would have covered?
I think so. I guess the one that is an uncomfortable one for me that people ask is what do you do with the folks that aren't coming along on the EO enthusiasm journey. Yeah, I'm trying to think of another word other than journey because I think journey gets a bad name, doesn't it? It gets used quite a bit, but yeah, journey is the word really. Because I don't have a good answer for that, and I think we're fortunate that in their own way, most of our team are now are getting it, and are changing the way that they see the business. But we've got to remember that, and this was the case of our company. Nobody, nobody entered into this. Well, I'll correct myself there. Some people did because we've employed some people since we became employee owned. But even still, when they set out to find a company to work for, even they weren't looking to enter an employee ownership trust. Not that I know of, anyway. Maybe one day that will happen once EO becomes so well known in the marketplace that people will seek out employee owned businesses. Should I ever have to move on for any reason from Grapevine, I would want to work for another EO because for me it's like there's no going back on that now. But for everyone else in the company, they didn't enter into it. They entered into a job. They were expecting to come, do their work and leave at the end of the day and be paid, for that contribution that they've made. To say, there's an additional expectation of you now, but the benefits are greater. I just think it's a big ask to think that everybody is going to get that immediately, and I think, as probably you do, Barry, like a lot of EO businesses that you speak to, that's the thing that they are wrestling with, isn't it? Is how do I get everybody on board? And maybe 100% isn't realistic, but 80% is a good outcome, and then it's about working towards getting to that 100%. And maybe you'll never get there, but like I said before, it's still the right thing to do. If we were to say, okay, so we're going to concentrate on the 80% of people, and the 20% we're never going to try and engage them again, that would be wrong. That we still have to invite them to be a part of what's happening, and then ultimately it's on them to decide.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Interestingly, when we talk to new team members here, I guess they would, and we asked them what fascinated you about Paradigm Norton, or why did you want to join us? They'd immediately go to culture and the website. They'd talk about our strapline of money matters, but life matters more. They like that. But actually, when you start then drilling into that a little bit more about what is it about the culture that you like, or that you sense from perhaps initial meetings or looking at the website, it is two things. It's one, the fact that we're employee owned, and the other is the fact we're a B Corp. And they really come through strongly in the interview process when we're bringing in new partners. But to your point about, do you ever get to 100%? I don't think you do. And it feels like, for me, like lots of change processes, you often end up with a group that are, I would always say, they're your real advocates. They really love EO. They're bought into it. You've got that. And I don't know, in the past I've talked about, perhaps that's a third of the business. So for us, that's about 30 people. You've then got 30 people who are enthusiastic, but perhaps not raving advocates. And then you've got a third that are not necessarily detractors, but it's sort of, I joined Paradigm Norton to do a good job, not necessarily to get engaged in joining a trust board or a partner voice group. And I think if you can gradually move the percentages, so you end up with, rather than a third as advocates, you end up with 40%, and gradually do that over time. But I think it does take time. And I have done one of my blogs about the sort of transition through an EO business of you start off with the transaction, you then have the transition, but actually what you're really looking for is transformation. And I genuinely believe that takes time, and businesses really have to work on that to get to that point where you are bringing that, not necessarily, as I say, doubting third, but the group that are not particularly initially supportive. It's just bringing them on that. And I can't think of a better word than journey for at the moment in terms of what that stands for. That's really helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's some things, I love that I can be, slightly self-deprecating about some of the things that I tried that I can now say didn't work. I perhaps wouldn't be so honest about that, or wouldn't have been so honest about it at the time, because it was the only thing that I tried. So you're right about, I like those free teas there, because that's right. Transformation sort of only happens really when you look back at it, doesn't it? Really, you can be transitioning, but transformation is kind of the end of that, isn't it? And yeah, I think that's why it's quite nice to have these conversations and kind of reflect on that, because yeah, looking back, there are missteps along the way, but yeah, to be able to show those people that picture back in 2022, I mean, I think it would blow everyone's minds, mine included. I didn't think we'd get to here, and that excites me again, because it makes me think, well, where are we going to be in another 3 years once we've hit financial freedom, hopefully within the next 3 years, and then we have that money to invest and kind of just starts a new chapter. Yeah, chapter's another one that gets overused, but.
A couple of just final questions that we ask, or I ask all guests, and towards the end of the podcast. So finish the sentence, Liam, for me, if you would. Employee ownership is?
Empowering.
My biggest EO surprise was?
The community.
Okay, interesting. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
The community is we've been talking about words that are being overused. Community. Everybody now and their dog wants to start a community, and I'm fortunate to be part of some other communities that I was involved with pre-EO that probably didn't even know that they were a community per se. They were just groups of people that got together regularly that had shared interests, that now are happy to kind of use the community badge, because it's like, we're doing this. This is the thing that everyone's supposed to be doing. I just didn't, though I knew of a few companies that had become EO, I didn't realize in advance how big a thing it was. I remember at the first conference I went to, which was the 2024 one, at the dinner event, I was sat next to Neil Palmer, I think that's his name, from Field Fisher. And he was telling me that he's like, yeah, he said, I've been coming along to these for about 14, 15 years. He said when it first started, it was just someone stood on a soapbox in the corner of a room. And I was like, my God, I just had no idea that this had grown up through in such a way. And obviously, as we now see the snowball effect of the pickup of the number of transitions to EOTs and EOBs in general, that yeah, it's crazy. But I didn't know that everyone would connect in such a kind and selfless way. It's incredible. But we're all in business. You kind of expect that people are going to want something out of their generosity, and often they don't. But yet we are seeing opportunities that are coming to us through the EO community. So I think when you go into things and you don't go hard sell, and you just go to be contributing to a positive thing, everything just kind of falls into place nicely anyway.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the EOA do an amazing job there, and the EO community more generally. But I think it is a sort of, you reap what you sow. And I think a lot of people tend to go to these events and things wanting to give out. And if you do that, you also at some point receive at the same time. So no, I'm totally with you on that. I don't know if you're a book reader, but often I like to share a book. It doesn't have to be an EO book because there's not all that many out there, but any books, business books in particular, that have inspired you along your journey, using the journey word again?
I will confess that I don't read a lot of business books. I tend to be a bit more bit more fiction, sorry, rather than non-fiction. What I tend to do is read a lot more newsletters from different people, and one that I'd say has changed how I look at business in general is You Are the Media. And Mark, who is behind that, has actually written a book which I've never read because when he wrote it in 2015, it sort of became irrelevant as soon as as soon as it went to print, which is why he hasn't written another book since, and instead writes weekly around this theme of. To be honest, it has evolved into being about community, but to begin with, it was more about having a owned approach to media. So rather than feeling that you need to have press coverage, that you become your own press outlet, which Barry, you've done with this podcast, and it's a good example of it, is that, you, for example, and I'm sure you've been on people's podcasts, but let's say that you wanted to talk and be on a podcast, but, it's difficult to find those inroads into that the advice is start your own, don't wait for the Guardian to invite you onto their podcast. Take the Guardian on. Do it that way, and that has, in Mark's writing, it's sort of evolved more into, once you do this and once you become a media outlet of your own, that actually you start to build a community, because what evolves around it is an audience that isn't just a passive audience. They sort of put back in as much as they give out, similar as you were saying with the EOA. So yeah, I think Mark was a little bit ahead of the game on some of this, and I'm pleased to be able to call him a friend now. I mean, he's from the local area, and You Are the Media events are the most vibrant events you can go to. So it's a newsletter that is published every Thursday, but we have monthly lunch clubs in Bristol, Poole and London, and then an annual conference called Creator Day that happens here in Poole. So I've broken the rules a little bit there. It's not a book, but it's as good as a book, if not better.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for sharing that. We'll put that in the show notes. That sounds really interesting. To wrap up, we have a leadership confessional. Okay, but you have some choices here. You need to choose from one of the three following: a moment of honesty. So that could be a decision you regret; a moment of self-doubt. So that's a moment of honesty. An unfiltered story. So that could be a story about a difficult setback for your company, or someone you've had to fire in the past, or a secret struggle, imposter syndrome, balancing work and family, etc. Do you have one that immediately springs to mind? A moment of honesty, an unfiltered story, or a secret struggle?
This is quite a big one. I'd say that when I came into the role at Grapevine, I thought it was going to be easy. And that was in part because the work that I was doing for them was fairly straightforward at that point, and they knew who they were as a business. When they see, this is, I'll go back to talking about Grapevine as they, but at that point to me they were they. When they acquired the IT company, everything changed overnight. It went from being a reselling business, reselling mobile contracts, to becoming a service provider. Now, that is culturally, structurally very, very different. And I did not realize what I was getting into, and ended up getting involved in all sorts of things over the 10 years that I've been with the company, that in hindsight probably set me up quite well for the role that I have now within the EOT. But I'd say for the first couple of years, I wouldn't say I was drowning, but I just don't feel that I was doing particularly good work. And bless the team for supporting me during those years. But I almost feel like I could just maybe those years were important because, on reflection, you learn a lot, but they almost amount to nothing to me in a way, because I just felt that, yeah, I really felt that it was that I was kind of drowning in it, that I just wasn't getting any traction, that networks that I thought that we could be a shoe-in for, it was more difficult to crack. And yeah, the first couple of years, I don't even know if I call it imposter syndrome. It was just outright, what on earth am I doing? And it started to get easier when the pandemic happened, because it sort of pulled things into focus a bit. And then I think by the time the EO transition happened, it was a big payoff for all those years of figuring out what this company is, how it's changed, what my role is, how I can contribute, not feeling that every day I need to be a marketing manager, and actually just looking for where I can contribute best, and just each day running towards that, and just supporting on that activity. And in a small business of 24, I think that's probably the best anyone can do, within reason.
Sure. Brilliant. Thank you. Lovely moment of honesty there. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. There's some absolute gems in there. Thank you for your everything you've shared, really, in terms of the Grapevine journey, your story, the highs and the lows, what you're working on. I think there'll be some real inspiration for other EO businesses. So yeah, thanks for your time, and hope you have a good rest of your day, whatever you're doing. Thanks, Liam.
Thank you for having me, Barry. I really enjoyed it.